Vitale. So let's give them a little applause real quick, and then I'll introduce them. So Dr. Vince completed his undergraduate studies at Princeton, and Dr. Joe completed hers at Oxford. And then Vince and Joe both completed their master's and PhD studies at Oxford University. They are educators, authors, and apologists, and they have each commended the Christian faith in numerous countries and on the campuses of many leading universities, churches, and companies. Tonight, they will be giving a talk about the compelling claims of Christianity as we approach the Christmas season. So everybody please give a warm welcome to Drs. Joe and Vince.
Thank you. Thanks, Ava, and so good to be with you all. Thanks for not booing at Princeton. Appreciate that as well. And I'm gonna give the talk tonight. So Joe and I have been speaking in Boston for the last week, and we've been kind of taking turns speaking. And then the other of us watches our 3- and 4-year-olds who are currently in the lounge through that wall. That is clearly the harder job than to actually have to give the talk. So Joe spoke on Wednesday, so I'll speak today. But just wanted to kind of let you guys be introduced to Joe, and we'll stick around afterwards as long as people want to talk and might have questions. And Joe's the smarter one of us and has a much nicer accent than I do as well, so wanted to make sure you had an opportunity to say hi to her.
Yeah. Hi guys, I'm sorry I can't stick around with you this evening, but if you hear screams coming through the walls, that's me being tortured by our children. Just wanted to let you know that I'll be around afterwards, so if anyone wants to talk about anything that's come up tonight or has any questions, I'd love to do that. Everyone starts with the big questions of life. I think from a different starting point for me, I grew up as a pastor's kid, but I had a ton of questions that really came up for me in college. I was working in the Old Testament and wound up writing my PhD, particularly on the question of how does God see women and what is their value and what does the Bible have to say about that, because that was my particular area of struggle. So if you have any questions in that kind of space around the Bible, around the character of God, around women, anything else as well, but particularly that, just wanted to let you guys know. But yeah, have a great evening, and we'll try to keep the noise down.
Thanks, Joe.
Yeah.
Anybody prefer my accent to Joe's?
Nobody prefers your accent.
No, nobody. I ask every time, and still no one. Yeah, that's good. That's great. So actually, in some ways, our 3- and 4-year-old have sort of motivated the development of this talk because I've been thinking a lot about the crazy claims of Christmas, and we got sort of a PowerPoint that we'll kind of flick through as we go. But really, just the feeling of, and you heard it in some of the songs that we just sang, like this feeling of wonder and awe that, you sort of hear in the Christmas songs and that you sort of naturally get from a 3- and a 4-year-old. And it made me think about kind of my own experience of Christmas as a young kid, and that wonder of sort of, lights everywhere and letters, being whisked away up the chimney in some sort of magic way, like reindeer that were flying through the air, to get to every single house in one night, which, if you were like me and you actually did the math, you were like, well, that involves some sort of time travel, so there's just lots of like wondrous kind of awesome things going on around this Christmas story. But maybe for you it was like the wonder around a different religious holiday or tradition, or maybe it was like the depths of the ocean floor or outer space, like something that opened up your mind to like, that's crazy and wondrous, but maybe it's true. And my kids, who maybe you'll meet at the end if they're still awake, they'll probably be very crazy by then, but my kids keep reminding me of this wonder. I told them, like, right when you hear me say that, that's when you come in. So obedient. So they keep reminding me of this, like we're driving, maybe the next slide, we're driving in a car the other day, and there's a rainbow, and I'm just like, oh look, it's a rainbow. And they're like, rainbow! And they're just so excited by everything they see out the car window. Like, we'll be driving at night, and just like stoplights, there'll be a green light, red light, and then there'll be an airplane in the sky, and they're like, airplane, and I've just been reflecting on that, and I'm like, you know what, they're right. Like, the fact that we can harness electricity and somehow bring it like thousands of miles and then come out whatever color we want in the lights in the street, like, that is incredible. Like an airplane, like fully stocked, some of those airplanes are over 1 million pounds, and it's just flying through the air for thousands of miles, and my kids are like, whoa, like the wonder of that. And I'm just like, sitting down thinking this is totally normal. I'm like uncomfortable. I'm just like, yeah, I'll have the pretzels and a Diet Coke. You know, like my kids actually have it right about the wonder of the world. And I've just been reflecting on how that sense of wonder, it kind of, at least for me, my experience, it sort of changed in its connotation as I got older. As a kid, I wondered with this awe and curiosity and idealism. And the older I got, the more I became an adult, the more I started to wonder with kind of suspicion and cynicism. You know, I wonder how delayed my flight will be. I wonder if they'll actually get my bags there. You know, as if that's such an easy thing to do, to fly this 1 million-pound plane across the sky and get my bags to this little carousel for me to kind of pick up. The wonder, the times I used that word even in my vocabulary, tended to be more cynical, tended to be more suspicious. When I was about 7 years old, my brother and I, so we used to leave letters for Santa in the chimney, and they'd be kind of whisked away, and we would put on these letters what we wanted for Christmas. And so one year when I was about 7, my dad saved it, because this is what I wanted for Christmas. The answer to this question: Dear Santa and God. So I like how they were kind of conflated in my mind. I thought they lived together. I thought, look, if one of them doesn't have the answer, the other one's going to. You know, somebody's going to have it. Was God ever born? And that was kind of, I guess, like a kind of glimpse into the trajectory of my life, that like most of my friends wanted a superhero toy, and I wanted the answer to like an age-old philosophical dilemma at 7. But it showed that by 7 years old, I already began to realize, there's some weird stuff about this Christmas idea. You know, there's a bit of craziness around this Christmas idea. You could take that in 2 ways. One, like, was God, if there is a God, where did he come from? Like, was he born? Did he always exist? And then in particular, the Christmas idea too, that God was somehow, the infinite God of the universe was somehow born as a little baby. Okay, there's a bit of oddness about that as well. And I think I gradually, maybe from this point forward, I just kind of started to become more skeptical because of the kind of craziness of some of these claims around faith, both about Santa and about God, I think. I started to not think much about either of them, and just kind of pushed it to the side until college. I had 2 soccer teammates who invited me to a meeting pretty similar to this, and then challenged me to actually read the Bible and start with the New Testament, the stories about Jesus' life, before I made my mind up about faith, because I hadn't done that. And I began to read through the New Testament, and I was very confident in myself, and I would cross things out, and I would add things in the margins. I'd actually, at this old Bible, where I'd actually write a BS in the margin wherever I disagreed. And Christians would sort of say, Vince, why do you have a BS in the margin of your Bible? And it's, oh, that verse makes for a great Bible study. That was sort of my starting point. However, even though I had lots of questions, and I was wrestling through it, I did find myself deeply drawn to the person of Jesus. There was just something about the way that he carried himself. There was something about the way that he treated people, in particular the people who were most vulnerable and marginalized. You know, a woman who was caught in adultery, they wanted to stone her. They came to Jesus and he said, "You who are without sin, throw the first stone." And one by one, they each walked away. His longest recorded conversation is with a Samaritan, with a woman, a foreigner, and there's some evidence in the text, someone who would have been an outcast in her society. 3 reasons why everybody else would have thought, this is the last person that's worth your time of day. This is the last person you talk to. And the longest conversation that we have in the Bible in John 4 is Jesus talking with this woman in such a beautiful way. So I was attracted to the person of Jesus. Do to others as you would have them do to you. We kind of know that as the golden rule now, and sometimes we kind of think, oh, that's just sort of some secular saying that was in all sorts of ancient literature. That was never said until Jesus said, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. If we really reflect on that, that's a radical statement. And so Jesus was living that way. He was speaking those sorts of words, and I was attracted to it. There was something in me that knew this is what's supposed to be in my heart, but it's not what's in my heart. And I found that intriguing, and I was drawn to it. But I sort of thought, too bad it's crazy. I found myself drawn to it, but I thought, too bad it's crazy. And I actually remember walking into a bookshop at one point, and I picked up a book off the shelf, and it described itself on the back cover as trying to hold on to a form of Christianity while explaining away everything miraculous in naturalistic terms. And I can remember sort of hoping it could be done, because I was being drawn to the person of Jesus, how he lived, what he taught, but I thought, too bad, it's crazy. It's just too ridiculous to believe. And Ricky Gervais has a quote that kind of sums this up a bit. Imagine if you carried on believing in Santa and the Tooth Fairy into adulthood. Ha ha. Imagine that. And he's saying this, referring not only to Santa and the Tooth Fairy, but also this idea of continuing to believe in God. Isn't that silly or childish in some ways? But I've been reflecting on this, and the first thought I had was, what? Even as adults, we believe, or lots of us believe, in some crazy stuff. About 30% of Americans believe in astrology. Maybe not 30% of Harvard students, but 30% of people. During my graduate studies, though, at Oxford, I lived with three other people in a house, and in one of those great college conversations, late, probably 2 a.m. or something, it became apparent that my other three housemates all believed in ghosts. They all believed in ghosts, but they were Oxford graduate students in the sciences. Like, they were smart people, and this just kind of came out in this conversation. These experiences they had, they were committed to it. And I found it a really interesting conversation, because up until that point, I had been like the really weird one in the house because I believed in God, and they didn't believe in God. And I was like, wait, we got to start this whole conversation over, because, okay, I believe in God. All right, I'm willing to say that's a bit weird. You believe in ghosts. So, maybe we can start the conversation over and say, hey, we all believe in some weird stuff. Another belief, I don't know if you all have had much experience with this yet, but another belief that always gets me is the supreme overconfidence that people have about the gender that a baby is going to be when a woman is pregnant. I don't know, if you had a lot of experience with that at your age yet, but it's quite amazing. Just normal, rational people who are normally normal in their beliefs, all of a sudden someone's pregnant, and they are now all of a sudden they have some sort of supernatural intuition. The scan will come back at 20 weeks and say one thing, and they're like, no, I know, it's not, it's not that, it's this. It's just some amazing things that even people who are quite rational tend to often have these crazy beliefs. And even if you don't, believe in those things, the ghosts or the astrology, because you're, sober-minded, smart Harvard students, there's actually lots of weird stuff that we all believe in. Right now, you believe, or at least after I say this sentence, you probably will, you believe that you're sitting on a rock rotating at 1,000 miles an hour, flying around the sun at 67,000 miles an hour. It's part of a galaxy that's being hurled through the universe at over 1,000,000 miles an hour. That's ridiculous. That's what's happening right now. That's quite a remarkable thing, and a remarkable thing to believe. And somehow I tend to just walk around unamazed at life. What's going on? Not much. How's life? Same old. It's pretty amazing, though. And if we just take a step back, there's just so much about life that is utterly crazy. I'm just going to run through a bit of it, and then I'll connect back in with our theme. But even sometimes some of our most basic beliefs, like the fact that the sun will rise tomorrow, okay? Just totally take that for granted. That the universe is going to carry on in a regular way, as it has done moment after moment, day after day, year after year. That gravity is going to exert the same strength tomorrow that it does today. We never take the step back to say, well, why? I mean, logically, there's an infinite number of different strengths it could take tomorrow. Why think it's going to take the same strength tomorrow that it's taken today? And you might say to me, well, it took that strength yesterday and the day before and the week before, so it's going to take that tomorrow. Okay, fair point. But that's not really an answer to the question. That is the question. Why? Why has gravity and all these other fundamental constants remained regular moment after moment, day after day, year after year, that we can have this confidence that it's going to continue to do so? It's actually not easy to give an answer to that question, but it's this remarkable thing, this remarkable belief that we have. It's actually the foundation of the entire scientific enterprise that we have this regularity, and there's actually a craziness to it that's not easily explained, but we just take it for granted every day. And so many, I think, of our beliefs are really weird. Like, I want you to try a little thought experiment for me here for a moment. So I want you to think about the answer to 13 times 12, okay? 13 times 12. Don't work too hard. I know you got classes and stuff and exams you got to do. Okay, all right. And now I want you to think about the most beautiful place that you've ever been. And I personally think it's pretty remarkable that you just moved 2 different physical regions of your brain just by thinking about 2 different types of things. And there's a really interesting question to be asked that people have spent a lot of time thinking about. What is this you that just did that? And it's not that easy to say. It's hard to pinpoint you as just some physical part of your body because you seem to be an independent entity that your body is responding to when you think these different things. And there's lots of different debates about how to understand this, but many smart people over the centuries have come to the conclusion that what you are most fundamentally is an immaterial mind, or sometimes referred to as a Cartesian ego. And if that's right, maybe it's not, but it's at least a legitimate belief, and it has been over many centuries, then you as an immaterial being are capable, merely by thinking, of moving the physical matter in different parts of your brain. That's pretty crazy. And now, when you did that, when you multiplied 13 times 12 and you got 156, hopefully, what is this number 12 that you know something about? Have you ever thought about that? Like, you weren't thinking about 12 particular people or 12 particular apples. You were thinking about the number 12, this sort of universal thing that could be applied to people or to apples or to oranges. What is this number 12? And again, many people, at least throughout the ages, have come to the conclusion that the number 12 and the other numbers is an abstract object, like the color red or the letter R. And that actually raises an interesting challenge. How can we know anything about an immaterial abstract object like the number 12? Most people have thought that abstract objects are causally inert. They don't do stuff. You can't sort of run into the number 12 or get hit over the head by the number 12. It doesn't causally act. But generally, in order to know about something, you have to be able to tell a causal story between that thing and your brain. You know, how do I know that this wall is white or cream? Well, I can tell you a story about the person that came in and painted it, and then the properties of that color paint, and how the science works. Well, I can't tell you, but somebody could. That how the science works, that winds up in my eye, and then how my brain connects with that. I can tell you a causal story that starts with that wall and ends in my brain. Well, what's the causal story between the number 12 as this immaterial abstract object that a lot of people have thought that it is, and my brain? It's not easy to say how my brain connects with something so odd as that. Another really interesting thing about just a general belief that we operate with every day, but we tend not to take a step back and think about just how weird or kind of challenging or even crazy it is. That's called referring in the direction of what's called the Benassarath dilemma. There's a Princeton professor in the early 70s who wrote about that, if anybody's interested. And I'll just take this one step further. It's not just our assumption that we can know abstract objects that's weird. Actually, the idea that we can know anything at all is also quite interesting. So if I told you, if you asked me the time of day, and I said, oh yeah, wait 1 minute, I'll check for you. And then I got the scale out of my bathroom and stood on the scale and gave you the numbers on the scale, what would you think?
Crazy.
You think I'm crazy. Why? that's not how you tell the time, okay? The scale was not put together, to be aimed at telling time. It was aimed at telling weight, even though, a couple times a day, you might get lucky, you might look down and, see 154, and it happens to be 154. You might get lucky once in a while, but that's not what the scale is made for, and so it would be kind of crazy to use that piece of equipment in order to tell the time. And what I find interesting, and other people have found interesting, is that if you think about our brains from just a purely naturalistic perspective, they're not actually aimed at truth. They're aimed at survival. From a naturalistic evolutionary perspective, it makes sense that our brains would develop in a way that would give us survival-conducive beliefs, beliefs that would be prone to survival-conducive behavior. But that's quite a different thing from beliefs that are true. For any survival-conducive behavior that evolution wants me to have, there might be some true beliefs that would get that behavior, but there's also going to be an infinite number of wacky beliefs that I could just make up that would give me this same exact behavior. So it at least raises an interesting question. It's not easy. Again, we just walk around with this assumption, of course my brain tells me the truth. But we tend not to step back and realize how much craziness is kind of in a lot of our general beliefs that requires exploring. Is trusting our brains, something which is aimed at survival, to give us truth, a bit like stepping on the scale aimed at weight and assuming it's going to give us the time? At least a question worth asking. If you're more interested in that one, you might read Alvin Plantinga talking about the argument against evolutionary naturalism. And so at least in my experience, the deeper that I dig, the more I tend to realize our world is chock full of all sorts of crazy beliefs. 99.9999999% of the chair you are sitting on right now, give or take, is immaterial, empty space. I think that's pretty wacky. Even crazier than that, sort of next slide. If there is no God, how come the world fits so perfectly into a chicken? Just like making sure everyone's still listening at that point. But back to being serious, if you do think about not just the world, but the universe, cosmologists have estimated that if you just think that the universe is based on pure chance, if it's just randomness, it's just pure chance, given all the different forms that a universe could logically take, it's actually ridiculously unlikely that it would wind up being a universe which allows for the possibility of life to exist. You can take just one example of this, and feel free to go through the slides as I kind of get to them, but just one example of this. The explosive force of the initial expansion of the universe. If it's just the slightest bit stronger, the universe just disperses into thin air. Particles wind up so far from each other, all you could get would be cold, simple molecules, nothing like the sort of complex chemistry required for any form of life. If it's just the slightest bit weaker, gravity makes the universe immediately collapse back in on itself. Again, no opportunity for the possibility of life. People have estimated something in like 1 part in 10 to the 60th, that's the percentage, 0.057 zeros and a 1. It's the sort of percentages that we're talking about. And there are quite a lot of people who have reflected on this. You can't take the numbers too seriously when you're talking about these sorts of things, but they're small numbers. Mathematician Sir Roger Penrose, winner of the Nobel Prize in Physics, he estimated that the overall difference you could have, if you took into account all of the fundamental constants of the universe, the overall difference you could have while still allowing for the possibility of life, he estimated would be 1 part in 10 to the power of 10 to the power of 123. That's like a ridiculous number. If you turned all of the matter in the universe into paper, you still wouldn't have nearly enough paper to print the required number of zeros to get that sort of decimal. Okay, you'd need more zeros than there are particles in the universe, is kind of what we're talking about. And then Sir Fred Hoyle, the late Cambridge astronomer, he compared the random emergence. He said if it was just based on randomness, given all the logical possibilities of the way the universe could be, if it was just based on randomness, he says the chance that you could have a universe that allowed for even cells, let alone human life. He said, think of it this way, you can't take the numbers too seriously. He said, but think about it this way, it's like if you had a tornado that was blowing through a junkyard and just happened to produce a perfect Boeing 747 airplane. those are the sorts of probabilities that a lot of people that think a lot about cosmology are saying is necessary in order to wind up with life. And that, again, that's pretty remarkable. It's a pretty crazy aspect of our universe. It's like if you sat down to play poker with Ava at lunch, okay? And anybody know Ava? Is she a pretty honest person? Yeah, okay. I got a shoulder shrug, Ava. You give him a hard time for that later. Okay, so Ava's pretty honest. But then in the first round of cards, she gets this, okay? She gets a royal flush. And first round of cards, that's amazing, but you're probably thinking, okay, well done. But then if you went to the second round, okay, let's try again. Second round, and she got this hand again. And then you go to the third round, and she got this hand again. And now you keep playing. And 10 rounds in, she's gotten this 10 times. What's happening?
I'm really lucky.
She's cheating, right? Like, no matter how honest you think she is, either she's cheating or in some way, someone is arranging the system in some sort of way, because even if she's a really honest person, it's just so incredibly unlikely on that hypothesis that it should at least make you entertain seriously another hypothesis. And if she just kept getting royal flush after royal flush after royal flush, and you just sat there and just said, wow, you are just the luckiest person I've ever met, right? At some point, that would become pretty irrational. And our universe is like showing up at this card game and seeing in the fundamental constants of the universe, royal flush after royal flush necessary for even the possibility of life to be a reality. And all of this craziness I've talked about, I mean, to this point, we haven't even touched the quantum realm, which is, perhaps the craziest of all. It's not an area of expertise for me. Some of you probably know more than I do, but at least on some significantly considered hypotheses, I mean, you have quantum entities that behave differently based on whether or not we are observing them. Like, if you're not looking at it, it behaves one way, and then if you look at it, it behaves differently. And people are trying to figure out why. It's just super weird. There are hypotheses on which quantum entities can seemingly be in two different locations at once. Well, that's just sort of mind-blowing. Or even thinking about electrons and protons, this kind of wave-particle duality. Equally accurate to refer to them as waves or as particles, even though waves and particles are two very different types of things. And for the point I'm making, we don't have to assume that all of those theories are correct, but more just that, look, these are live options in the literature. These are considered legitimate beliefs. And what I find interesting is that, when we talk about, say, quantum, you have a conversation about those things. And if you never heard of that before, and then somebody who knows a bit about what they're talking about talks to you about those things, by the end of the conversation, you're probably thinking, whoa, that's really cool. Quantum physics is really cool. But it's interesting to me that when we get into the faith dimension, oftentimes when we talk about the things and they seem really crazy, we kind of jump to the conclusion of, oh, that's really stupid. And I find it interesting that, for example, in certain realms, in scientific realms, for instance, crazy is cool. But in faith, crazy tends to be seen as stupid. And I think it's at least worth exploring. Like, is there a bit of a double standard there? Should we think more about that? Because the more I learn, the more convinced I am that God and science, for example, kind of have crazy in common. Okay, I actually, I thought science was going to sort of disprove God for me, but the more I dug into science, the more I felt it actually gave me the license to believe the unbelievable. Because I kept finding more and more unbelievable things, and I thought, okay, actually, I can't dismiss something just because it seems crazy. There's all sorts of crazy stuff in this world. And so God being an immaterial being, as a Christian, I'm willing to put my hand up and say, yep, that's pretty crazy. But I also think it's pretty crazy that most of the chair you're sitting on right now is immaterial. And God being omnipresent, the idea that God can be everywhere at once, yeah, I'm willing to put my hand up and say, okay, that's pretty wacky. But I also think it's pretty wacky that scientists are telling me that at the quantum realm, particles can be in more than one place at once. And the idea that Jesus, in kind of Christian theology, is understood to be both God and also human, to have both a divine nature and a human nature. And this has been a paradox that has perplexed many people for a very long time. But I think it's interesting that even in the scientific realm, people can say, well, there's this wave-particle duality for electrons and protons. And so it's equally accurate to talk about them as waves or as particles. They have a wave nature and a particle nature, even though those seem to be two very different things. So hopefully you can follow kind of the trajectory that I've been on and kind of my own thinking. And if I zoom out, I give you lots of like kind of detailed examples. But if I zoom out and just ask you, for a minute to consider big picture explanations of the universe. Like, how did all of this get here? I call this the normalcy of the supernatural. And sometimes when you're asking a question like that, it's important to just get your options on the table. And if you ask this question, kind of, where did all this come from? Where did the universe come from? As far as I can see, there's only three primary competitors. One, God made it. Again, I'm willing to put my hand up and say that's a pretty crazy option. But what are the other alternatives? Number two, the universe popped into existence from nothing for no reason. And I just want to say, well, that's also quite a crazy alternative. The physical stuff in our everyday lives doesn't generally just pop in and out of existence. And so why should we think that it did at the beginning? Or a third option, maybe the universe or some series of universes has always existed, extending infinitely back in time without explanation. And I think this just pushes the weirdness one step back. Now maybe you can explain each part of the universe with a part that came before it, but you still have absolutely no explanation for why there are these universes in the first place. And you might even say, well, look, okay, fine, I can see that all three of the options are a bit crazy, so I'm not committing myself to any of them. I'm going to kind of remain pretty agnostic on this situation. But even if you do that, I still think you're committed to one of these three things being true. And I think that's crazy too, because all three of them are pretty crazy. And so at least for me personally, I kind of eventually came to the conclusion that we live in a crazy world. There's no getting around that. Christian, theist, atheist, agnostic, I think at some point we all have to realize, yeah, actually there's a lot of unbelievable stuff that's actually worth believing in the world. And I was having a conversation with a friend at one point, a retired Princeton professor. We were emailing back and forth, kind of debating some of the merits and demerits of believing in Christian faith. And at this point, I had become a Christian. This happened during my college years. And I was kind of putting forward some of the arguments, and he was sort of making some of the objections. At the end of his email, he wrote this long email with all of these different reasons why he didn't feel he could believe. And then his last line in the email simply said, "Nor can I believe in a virgin birth." And there was nothing further after that part of the email. And the implication seemed to be, it's just too crazy to believe in this Christmas claim that Jesus could have been born of a virgin. And I initially started to reply with maybe some of my reasons why perhaps you could consider believing that. And then it sort of dawned on me, well, maybe we all believe in a virgin birth of sorts. And I began to think more about what the alternatives are and how you understand the universe if you don't take an approach that includes God. And I began to identify places where people who don't believe in God were trying to give explanations. So this is one from the brilliant Cambridge physicist Stephen Hawking, his attempt to propose an atheistic explanation of our universe. And he says the universe can and will create itself from nothing. Spontaneous creation is the reason there is something rather than nothing, why the universe exists, why we exist. And I just found myself thinking that also sounds a lot to me like a virgin birth. I'm willing to put my hand up and say a virgin birth of God as a person and a little baby of Jesus. Yeah, crazy claim. But this sounds like a virgin birth to me too. Or in my area of philosophy of religion, this is Quentin Smith, the next slide, a prolific philosopher, 12 books, 150 peer-reviewed articles to his name, and his best attempt, he says, the fact of the matter is that the most reasonable belief is that we came from nothing, by nothing, and for nothing. We should acknowledge our foundation in nothingness and feel awe at the marvelous fact that we have a chance to participate briefly in this incredible sunburst that interrupts without reason the reign of non-being. And again, I just thought, well, that sounds a lot like a virgin birth as well. Maybe we're all kind of in the same boat in one respect, in that you can't get away from some of the crazy beliefs about this universe. And for me, at least, there were two significant aspects to that conclusion. One, I thought, you know what, hopefully I can have some more constructive conversation with people if that's true. If we can kind of get to the point where we kind of say, you know what, it's not like I have the same normal beliefs and you have the crazy beliefs, so you're stupid. Or you disagree with me, so you think you have the same normal beliefs and I have the crazy beliefs you disagree with, so I'm stupid. Well, maybe that's not that helpful, you know. Maybe instead we kind of say, no, look, you've got some crazy beliefs, and I've got some crazy beliefs. Maybe we shouldn't judge the beliefs based on whether they're crazy, because you know what? Crazy is all we've got. Instead, maybe we have to say, is there actually evidence for the crazy beliefs that you hold or the crazy beliefs that I hold? And maybe there's a kind of a productive conversation that can come out of it. And that was that other thing that was significant to me. If all we've got is crazy, then crazy is not really a criticism. Then the key distinction when it comes to our beliefs is not whether or not we see them as crazy, but rather whether there is evidence for them. And I found that, in a sense, very freeing. It kind of took me back to that wonder of my 3 and 4-year-old in the other room, looking out the window, looking at things that just seemed crazy to them, but wondering with that sort of anticipation and that hope and that awe of maybe there's crazy things in the universe that are actually true, rather than some of that kind of suspicion and cynicism that had crept in. And that made me return, in a sense, to some of the beliefs in Christianity that I once had thought were just too extraordinary to believe. And I'll give you just a couple examples of those. One was some of the, in a sense, crazy things that Jesus said about himself as I read through the New Testament for the first time. And as I did, I just came across dozens of different statements of things Jesus said about himself. And I thought, wow, he's making really big claims about himself. He claimed to exist before Abraham, who existed thousands of years ago. He claimed to be able to forgive people's sins, which, if you take a moment to think about that, it's a really weird thing to do. Not like sins against him, but just their sins generally. Like if I saw one of you sin against the other, and from here I said, oh, I forgive you, like there'd be something weird about that, unless I was making a claim to be kind of an overarching figure in the whole system. He said on this next slide, I'm the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live even though they die, and whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Whoa, like that's an extraordinary claim. There's some sense in which your eternal destiny is dependent on me and your beliefs about me. You know, if I stood up and said something like that, you would think, whoa, that's a crazy claim. And because of that, there's only so many options in terms of what you think about a claim like that. If either Jesus thought he was telling the truth or he didn't think he was telling the truth when he said something like this. And like I said, it's not just 1 or 2 claims, but dozens of these, which gives me confidence that historically he was making these sorts of statements. Somebody does believe that that's true and they're wrong, well then they're severely mentally ill. Okay, they think things about themselves which are radically different from what is actually true about them. And as I was reading through the New Testament, I was reading through partly with that question in mind. And read it for yourself, but at least for me, I read through it and I thought, this is the most composed person I've ever seen. This is the most psychologically stable life I've ever seen lived. And he was making claims like this. Well, you know, what if he wasn't telling the truth and he knew it? Well, then you have to call him a liar. And you have to call him a pretty vicious liar for a few different reasons. One, he's a huge hypocrite because he's saying, I am the truth and I'm all about the truth, and he's making this huge lie about who he is. Okay. Secondly, he's lying at the expense of his friends' lives. Like, he knows his friends are being persecuted for this and are likely going to be killed because they believe this claim. If he didn't think it was true and he was trying to persuade his best friends that it was true, knowing that that was the cost for them, then that's a pretty vicious liar. And so it was just interesting for me to kind of put some of those options, C.S. Lewis talks about this, put some of those options next to each other and say, initially, at least for me, they all seem pretty unlikely. Seems like, whoa, it's a pretty extraordinary claim to think Jesus could be telling the truth here. But also, as I read of his life, I thought, boy, I'm really confident this person is not a vicious liar. I'm really confident that this person is just not sort of radically self-deceived about who they are. And it made me realize, okay, well, whatever belief I come to, it's probably going to have to be a belief that initially I thought was highly unlikely, because all the options I have are in that category, where initially I thought, no, that's that's pretty crazy. And so this phrase has become important to me. Criticism without alternative is empty. And as I kind of try to think through lots of different things, I try to keep that phrase in mind. You know, if you tell me, Vince, you've got a terrible phone, really horrendous phone, okay, happy to be open to your criticism, but I should say in response, well, what phone do you suggest I get instead? And if you then respond and say, oh, I've never come across a better phone than the one you have, then your criticism sort of dissolves. It loses its weight, right? Usually your criticism is dependent on you having an alternative which is better than the thing that I'm currently holding on to. And sometimes when it comes to all different beliefs in life, but I found this especially as I was pursuing the beliefs relevant to faith, sometimes I had this inclination to just dismiss a belief because it seemed crazy, without ever asking the question, well, what are the alternatives? And sometimes you put the alternatives next to each other and say, I've got 3 alternatives. They all seem really unlikely to me, but there's only those 3. One of them's got to be true. So I can't dismiss the belief just because it seems crazy to me. I have to pursue the evidence wherever it leads. And one other area which was very much like that for me had to do with the resurrection of Jesus, perhaps Christianity's most crazy claim. And when I began to look into the evidence for that claim that initially I would have just dismissed, I was quite astounded at what I found. And I can't go into it in great detail now, but I want to at least kind of just urge you in the direction of, if you haven't looked into it, look into it. I mean, this is a book by a former colleague of mine, Richard Swinburne. He's probably the most influential British philosopher of religion of the last 60 or 70 years. He held the head post at Oxford for many years. In 2003, he wrote this book, The Resurrection of God Incarnate, and he likes to work with probability theory, and so he kind of plugs in numbers as estimates at each point in kind of the argument. So you're not supposed to take the number too seriously, but nevertheless, in this book, he argues that if he gives what he thinks are just kind of fairly conservative estimates and plugs it into the appropriate probability theorems, that it's 97% probable that based on the available evidence today, that Jesus literally, physically, miraculously rose from the dead. Now, you may radically disagree with that, but I hope it's at least interesting to you that someone who really knows what they're talking about and is at the top of their field is able to make that claim, make it in print, have it be published by Oxford University Press, and ably defend it at top academic conferences all around the world. And when I began to look into some of these things, that was quite astonishing to me, that you could even have intellectual discussion at a robust level about these things. Here's one passage in the New Testament which is significant in this respect. There's tons to say here if we had time, but this is one passage where the Apostle Paul is talking in one of the letters he wrote to one of the churches, and he says, "What I received I passed on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried," and then this claim, this crazy claim, that he was raised on the 3rd day according to the Scriptures, and now this list of all these people that he appeared to after he clearly had been killed, and then he supposedly had raised from the dead. He appeared to Cephas, to Peter, and then to the 12 apostles. After that, he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers and sisters at the same time, most of whom are still living, which is quite a kind of amazing little phrase there to kind of say, hey, they're still alive. If you don't believe me, go out and ask them. Though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles, and last of all, he appeared to me also. And this just, again, I would just kind of urge everyone to say, how do we explain this? You know, because that's what I was doing. I was looking at this and saying, how do I explain this? How do I explain that it seems like there were lots of people walking around after Jesus clearly had been killed, utterly convinced that they were spending time with him, and that many of those people were so convinced of that they gave their lives for it rather than deny him. And I didn't know what to do with that. At first I thought, well, you know what, this must have been written like much, much later, and so it's probably like legendary development over time, you know, like you whisper something in your ear and you whisper it in your ear, and you kind of, you know, over here you kind of say, Jesus makes great bread. And then over here, it's like, Jesus rose from the dead. Then I learned that this passage is actually considered very widely to be an early creed that even predates the letter that it's a part of. The letter itself is from like AD 50, mid-50s, so 20 years after Jesus died. So that's already like extremely early within the lifetime of the people that it's speaking about. It would be unprecedented for there to be significant legendary development that quickly. But this portion of it is an early creed that was included in the letter, was passed around the early church, and even the most critical scholars who don't believe in the resurrection of Jesus date this creed to within months or a couple of years of Jesus' death and supposed resurrection. So right back to the time of the actual event. So I was like, oh man, okay, my hypothesis of legendary development is blown out of the water. That's not the explanation. So what is it? I actually arranged meetings at the time as an undergraduate with the two top New Testament professors at the time at my university, because they were not believers, but they had expertise in the area. And I thought, okay, I'm talking to Christians who are telling me, well, the explanation is that Jesus actually rose from the dead. But I thought, well, there's got to be other explanations. Criticism without alternative is empty, so what's the alternatives? And I met with one, and one sort of glanced in the direction of a sort of mass hallucination theory, but without conviction and without kind of much behind it. And it's that I kind of started to look into that theory and realized it has a lot of problems to it. And multiple people don't see the same hallucination more than they dream the same dream, let alone the sort of evidence that we have not only in that passage, but all over the New Testament of Jesus appearing not only to friends, but to enemies, both to individuals and to groups over a period of weeks in different regions of the area. It just can't account for that sort of robust evidence. And then I met with the other professor, and he said, as a historian, I'm simply not interested in the question. And I think the assumption was, as soon as we begin to talk about the miraculous, we're no longer talking about history. But I've never been able to understand why he thought he can make that assumption at the outset, rather than following the evidence wherever it led, and then determining what counts as history or what doesn't. But that was a real vivid experience for me, where I really came back to this idea that criticism without alternative is empty. There were a lot of people who were willing to criticize the resurrection and say, that's crazy, therefore it's stupid, therefore it couldn't be true. But when I actually went in search of alternative explanations, I couldn't find any. And the ones that I did find seemed as crazy as the one that was being proposed to me, Jesus actually rising from the dead. So I hope you'll go on a similar sort of journey that I did and find some of these similar things. And in some, I would say, in a crazy world, we need to judge beliefs based on their evidence, not on their craziness. And so let me return to Santa for a few minutes, and then we'll take a few questions. It's not actually precise to say that I stopped believing in Santa, because, you look at this Ricky Gervais quote, and, Santa and Tooth Fairy, and haha, imagine that you kept believing. But when I stopped believing in Santa, it's not like that made the presents under the tree just magically disappear. Like, they were still there. And when I put letters in the chimney, they still magically weren't there in the morning. Like, there was still evidence that I needed to deal with. And so I had to pursue the evidence. And, in some ways, what I found was that, Santa wasn't who I thought he was. He didn't live as far away as I thought that he did. He didn't only want to stop by once a year. It wasn't really that Santa didn't exist. It was that Santa wasn't who I thought he was. There's a sense in which Santa was actually my mom and my dad. And the question I want to ask of all of us is, could something similar be true with God? That some of us can remember a time where maybe we were told that God doesn't exist, or we were made to feel childish or foolish for believing in God. And so we sort of gave up the belief in God. But did we do that because we had thoroughly thought through the evidence, or because we just didn't want to feel childish or foolish? Because just giving up belief in God doesn't just do away with a lot of the things that require explanation in the universe. The universe still has, to my mind, this remarkable regularity. The fact that it even exists. The fact that it exists with such utter precision that human life could be possible. And then we look to the life of Jesus and the life that he lived, but then also the claims that he made about himself? And how are we to explain those claims? Was he actually telling the truth, or was he not? If he wasn't, what does that mean about him? How likely does that sound? What about the resurrection of Jesus? Again, even if we just say, I don't believe in the resurrection, well, then you're left with like the most massive hole in all of history. Because you have what should have been the movement-ending death of Jesus, movement over, and then very shortly thereafter, you have the eruption of one of the greatest movements of all time. And if you don't stick the resurrection in that gap there's still a massive gap there. And is it really the case that despite 2,000 years of academic scholarship and speculation, there's not a single remotely plausible explanation for how to bridge that gap? Criticism without alternative is empty. We have to think through the alternatives. And so I wonder also if there's, is there any more personal evidence in your life? One of my favorite questions to ask people is, have you ever had an experience that has made you think there might be a God? And I personally find it very interesting that when I ask that question, oftentimes there's sort of a pause and a lull, and if I wait long enough, somebody will say, well, there was this one time when, and people tell me the most remarkable stories. And I think, whoa, that's so interesting. That happened to you? And wait, you told me you don't believe in God. Okay, let's talk about those things. Sometimes we just never have had the conversation with ourselves. We had some sort of experience where we gave up on belief in God, but we had some other experiences in life that we kind of tucked away in some other corner and never sort of reconciled them. And I've got some of those experiences in my life. I'll just tell you one around Christmas time a few years ago. My wife and I had a miscarriage, and it was deeply impactful to us. And we went into the doctor's office, and we expected to hear the heartbeat, and we didn't. And we walked out in this sort of fog, traumatic fog, and we sat in the car, and we decided in the car that we had talked about the name Luca as a name, for the baby, and we decided in the car that yes, we're going to name the baby Luca. That's the name now. And then Joe said, I don't feel like going home and cooking. Can we just grab some food? And I said, yeah. I said, just jump on Yelp and just plug in whatever the top-rated pizza shop is in this town. Not knowing, not in a town we lived in, not knowing what it was. She hit Yelp, pizza, hit the button without looking at what it was. We drive 5 minutes down the road and pull into the pizza shop, and the pizza shop is called Pizzeria Luca. And yeah, just like the universe, you could interpret that as one royal flush after another, just remarkable luck. Or you could interpret that as there was somebody that knew what we were going through and wanted us to know that he knew, and that even though we might not understand it in full right now, that he was present with us and that he was going to walk with us through it. I wonder if you have some of those experiences in your life that you've tucked away in a corner, and maybe it's time to consider them more deeply. Santa and God, I thought they were kind of the same. They're actually really different. Santa stops by once a year, doesn't want to be seen. There's not evidence for Santa. You don't find adults who didn't believe in Santa as kids coming to believe in Santa as adults. You do find people like myself who didn't believe in Jesus as kids who come to a very firm conviction about Jesus as adults. Santa's kind of transactional, I tell him, what gift I wanted, and, he drops the gift off. I never thought to myself on Christmas, what I really want for Christmas this year? I really want to deepen my relationship with Santa. And I really want our friendship to go to the next level, right? Like, you didn't think that, because Santa's just popping in once a year. He's not staying long enough to say hello. He's actually, sneaking in, sneaking out, hoping not to be seen. And he's keeping this list of rights and wrongs, and he's going to give you coal if you don't do well enough. And the Christian conception of God, Jesus is just very different. The Bible says God is not far from any one of us. says that as far as the east is from the west, that's how far he desires to remove our guilt from us. He's all about relationship. You know, Santa sneaks in and sneaks out and is hoping not to be seen. You know, Jesus all over the New Testament. I hope you'll read it, but this is just one line. Here I am. I stand at the door and knock. It's very different than Santa, right? He's not coming through the chimney, sneaking in, sneaking out, hoping nobody notices. I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come in and eat with that person, and they with me. It's this invitation into relationship, and that is what Christmas is all about. Yes, the infinite, transcendent God of the universe, but one who didn't want to stay detached and far off, but wanted to come and live life as we lived it, so he could understand life as we understand it, so he could be with us in the most intimate way through everything that we go through, and he could invite us into that relationship with him. So I don't know if there are people, you know, in the room tonight that this has resonated with, where you know what, at some point I just kind of dismissed the belief in God because it seemed crazy, or maybe somebody made me feel like it was crazy, without ever realizing we live in a crazy universe. Some of that awe and wonder we feel, whether it's towards science or whether it's towards faith, that's a good thing and it's totally appropriate because we live in this remarkable universe. And could we have some of that childlike, Christmas-like awe again, where we take a look again at some of the extraordinary, remarkable, even crazy beliefs of Christmas and say, I'm not going to dismiss them just because they're crazy. I'm going to follow the evidence where it leads, and maybe it does lead to a beautiful place of being invited into a relationship that is secure and one where you don't need to worry year in and year out. Am I going to get gifts under the tree, or am I going to get coal? No, you step into a relationship where God says, I'll always be with you. I'll never forsake you. There's a security, because it's not I'm keeping a list and depending on how good you are, you get this or you get that. It's not a transaction or a reward. It's a gift that you receive, and a gift where Jesus says, on your best day or on your very worst day, my love for you is exactly the same and will remain unchanged yesterday, today, and forever. So I'm gonna pray a prayer for just a minute. One of the things that I did when I wasn't sure about all of this was I just started to pray even as an agnostic, as a seeker. And I just used to say, God, I'm not sure if I'm talking to anyone, but if I am, I'd love to know about it. I think God really loves and honors that sort of prayer, and there's nothing to lose with praying that sort of prayer. But if you pray it sincerely in your heart, the Bible says if you seek God with your whole heart, you will find him. That's a promise that is worth testing. So let me just pray that prayer for a minute. I just thank you, Lord, that you've given us such a extraordinary universe. And I thank you even for my kids and the way that they're just opening my eyes and also my heart to sort of some of that wonder, some of that idealism, some of that just amazement that kids have to look at the world in a hopeful way. And where there's so much going on right now in the world, in each one of our own lives, that can seem really difficult. So I just thank you this Christmas for that invitation to just awe and wonder and hope. And tonight in particular, I just want to pray for anybody who, even maybe as I asked that question, have you ever had an experience that made you think there might be a God? Maybe there was a way that you reached out, something that was unexplainable, or maybe even just something in their heart or their mind where they knew there was just a conviction that you were there, or they knew there was a conviction that they had done something wrong, and that there was something significant about that, and that they needed to say they were sorry for that, and they needed to ask for forgiveness from that. And they said, boy, where does that conviction come from? Where does that sense even come from? Whatever the experience was, Lord, I pray right now you just would bring it back to mind for people in this room. And I just want to join with those who want to and saying, God, if you are there, we would so love to know that. And whether you want to reveal yourself to us in a very astonishing big way, or in just a gentle whisper, you created each one of us, you know each one of us, you know the best way to offer yourself to each one of us. And so I just pray that each person would know your nearness and your love for them, and that as you, in the Christmas story, show us that there's nothing you wouldn't do to draw near to us, even coming and living a human life you didn't have to live, and ultimately suffering a human death that you didn't have to die out of love for us, that you would bring conviction in the hearts in this room to desire to step into that loving relationship with you and to give our whole selves to you. So thank you. Thank you that you've been with us tonight, that you've spoken to us in our minds and in our hearts and in the context of community. And we really just count it a privilege to have spent this time with you in Jesus' name. Oh man. Oh man. I know I've gone a bit long here, Fetty. What do you want me to hand over to the group and take questions just kind of personally after, or shall I do?
Yeah.
Is that good? Okay, so my wife and I are both going to be here. We're not going to go anywhere, so as long as you guys have questions, we'd love to continue to talk to you guys. The folks are going to come up, kind of start